And just to set the ball rolling, I'll make one initial proposition to you to elaborate on. And that is, both of you in your beautiful lectures mentioned that, some sort of distinction between just mere knowledge, book learning, and some kind of wisdom that comes from direct experience. And obviously there is a vast difference and yet a relationship between these two things with regards the spiritual path. And I'd like to just, if you can, elaborate a little more on both the differences and the relationship between these two, if you'd like.
Well, Jamal, do you wish to say, or shall I start?
Oh, I would love for you to start, Brother Ravi.
Well, as far as I can understand, really, unless the knowledge that I acquire or I believe I have transforms the quality of my being, that is not the sort of knowledge that is relevant to spiritual search. Because in the spiritual enterprise, the whole project has, strictly speaking, nothing to do with knowledge. It's not against knowledge. Knowledge can help, but it can also hinder. The kind of knowledge it is about or interested in is something that will transform the quality of their being, because that is the project. Can the quality of my being, ultimately, of course, this is a very high target, can come to being one with the one, ultimately. That is the call. Now, but that means it has certain consequences, such as whatever I know, whatever I call truth, is very much filled with love, compassion, a sense of oneness with the others, which is not, one can take an example where this does not apply. None of the scientific knowledge corresponds to this. None of the theological knowledge corresponds to this. In fact, I have met many professors of religion. With rare exceptions, they are not religious. What does this mean? They know a great deal about what St. Paul said, or Christ said, or the Buddha said, but it does not correspond to the quality of their being, which seems to me to be the main purpose of spiritual search. So Jamal, please, you say what you wish to
Well,
say.
thank you so much, Brother Ravi. That gives me an opening to really talk about, if I may, about Rumi's experience. He was at a young age, a very powerful, well-informed, learned professor at a very young age. But he says, when I met my teacher, Shams Tabriz, and my heart opened up, that was the key. When my heart opened up, that's when I moved from a knowledge of the tongue to a knowledge of the heart. When my heart opened up, amazing things happened. He said, I began to hear these inspirations from a source I had no idea existed. His famous words are, I began to hear bird song in the egg. When my heart opened up, I began to hear bird song in the egg. The Quran says the heart never falsified what it saw. To continue what Brother Ravi was saying, in Islamic spirituality, in Sufism, they say this wisdom, this spiritual knowledge can come when one has done or is doing the inner inconvenient work, which we have repeated again and again in my talk about transforming the ego from a commanding master into a personal assistant. When I polish my heart and when I open my heart, I do practices, then amazingly, I tap into a knowledge of the heart. I should also add that this spiritual wisdom also comes from one's life experiences, learning from life's experiences. It's interesting that both in Confucianism and in Sufi teaching, they talk about students who are learning from their sheikh or a teacher. And in several cases, the student has more, shall I say, greater quantity of some trait that we admire, but chooses to study with the teacher. Example, the teacher says that my student, this is both in Confucianism and also in Sufism, that the student is far more eloquent than I am, meaning the teacher. But the student does not know how to simply give an answer of yes or no. That's wisdom. This particular other student is much more courageous than the teacher. But the student doesn't know when to be cautious. Another student is much more dignified, regal, royal in his or her bearing, but doesn't know when to be unassuming, humble. You know that wonderful verse I like from Sufism, blessed are the flexible. Blessed are the flexible, for they will never be bent out of shape. So to summarize, that spiritual knowledge can come from that inner inconvenient work, spiritual practices, and also from life experiences, among other things.
John, do you wish to?
I'm not sure. I was just waiting in case you wanted to add to that at all, Ravi.
No, I don't need to really add anything here other than simply that it is silly to be against knowledge of any kind. Everything has its place in the universe, including the devil. So we don't even need to be against the devil. In fact, I'm always very struck by the fact that hardly any prophets in the Bible could get to heaven or come to God without being tested by the devil.
Absolutely.
Similarly, the Buddha, before he becomes the Buddha, he's being tested by Mara. So there is no reason to be against the devil. If I get against him, he will flunk me.
Yes, yes.
He is the main tester. So
Right.
I have to find the proper place for the devil, you know.
I think that's very, very beautifully said. You know, there's a wonderful verse, Brother Ravi, as you well know, in the Quran, every so way you turn is the face of Allah.
Yes.
So Islamic mystics are asked, are you telling me the devil is also the face of Allah?
Yes.
And what is the answer? Like you said, absolutely. Yes. Wow, the devil is the face of Allah. Yes, look in the Quran. The devil says to God, by your glory, by your power, I shall waylay humanity.
Yes.
And as you mentioned, the poetry of Rumi says, without a devil to test us, how can we grow our spiritual muscles? And again, Rumi explains, let me tell you, says Rumi, you know, God, out of a cosmic design, has the devil, but God does not necessarily approve of the devil. Now, that is a contradiction. What do you mean? So Rumi explains, he says, you know, a doctor, a medical doctor, for his or her livelihood, needs for people to become sick. But does that mean that the doctor wants them to suffer? No. A baker, says Rumi, for his or her livelihood, needs for people to be hungry. Does the baker approve of them starving? No. So these are the mysteries and the contradictions and the beauties of our existence.
But a remark of Rumi that I think has always struck me, if you have not yet seen the devil, go look in the mirror.
You're right. That's true. Yes.
But to some extent, I find maybe a little bit more comforting remark of the Buddha. In this very body, you can find all the demons and all the gods. So it's not only the demon in us, but also the divine.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. And that is why I guess the mystics, Islamic mystics, say we are here to evolve in the fullness of our being by having this free will and making those choices. In fact, Prophet Muhammad said, every day that you set out, Every single day in the course of your 24 hours, you're either ennobling or diminishing your soul. We have a choice every day. But we need the devil to awaken our power of choices.
Which is why I actually particularly like one Sufi saying, which, by the way, I also discovered was written in a wall on a monastery on Mount Athos, exactly the same words, much to my surprise, actually, that if you die before you die, you will not die when you die. But dying before dying,
Yes.
really, I think that's a very fundamental call in practically all serious spiritual teachings.
Right.
Dying to one's me. How can I be a little free of this?
Right. And the Quran suggests this work of dying to your false self continues in Islam in the realms after your death. So there's reincarnation, not on earth, according to Quran or according to understanding of the Quran, but in the stages of the higher levels of heaven. This work has to continue as you come closer and closer and closer to God.
Yes.
The work never ends.
Well, that is an interesting point then. I would like to ask about it. Is it true that the work never ends? Because if we think of, certainly from the Buddhist perspective, both of you are very familiar with the idea of enlightenment is, it's a goal and it's the end of the path. So both in your tradition, does the work really, for an individual, does it end?
Well, you see, it depends on what one always interprets as the work. For example, after the Buddha is enlightened, why was he going around teaching? His work didn't end. So the question of the work, if it means that I need yet to practice more in order to come to something, one might say that the great sages like the Buddha or Rumi have already come to some kind of a destination or the peak of the mountain. In that sense, one could say they don't have to now practice this or that. But their work changes in its quality. Then their work becomes instructing to others, teaching others, assisting the whole planet by bringing their wisdom. So in that sense, the work never ends. That's my understanding.
And in Islam, of course, the work is never ending in the sense that if you're on earth, I'll give you the example of that great mystic Kabir, who responds to a person who says, I just want, this world is too much with me, all these problems and dramas and melodramas, I just want to die. And of course, his answer was that, do you think that when you go over to the other side, if you don't break your ropes here on earth, if you do not break your ropes here on earth, do you think ghosts will do it for you in the next world? So in Islam, the work continues in the sense that, for example, in the Conference of the Birds, this is a beautiful classic by Fariduddin Attar, a very famous 13th century Islamic sage, whose work is considered a very primary reading, the Conference of the Birds. We go through 7 valleys, and the work continues till you reach where you're in a position of fana, becoming one with God. And the words are, the shadow was lost in the sun, and that is all. But that's in the other world, the work continues.
So don't think that we will stop working soon.
Don't give up your day job yet.
I wanted to follow on, Jamal, though, just on what you said. Is it possible for, within the Sufi and Islam tradition, would you say that it is possible to break the ropes in this life?
Yes, you could do that. See, what happens is, the question is, when you go over to the other side, what happens? And the Quran says that is hidden from you. So the speculation is, when you go over there, on the day of judgment, there is heaven and hell. Spiritual teachers will say not for punishment if you go to hell. If you go to hell, it is because you're given a second chance to purify yourself. In that sense, the work continues all the time till you reach the final stage. Was that your question? Unless I misunderstood your question.
Well, I don't want to labor. It was just the idea of, both of you have indicated that the goal of a spiritual life is this sort of union or a realization with an ultimate reality, by whatever name we want to give it. And it is a training and work to be done to do that. And it's, when I hear you speak, like what you're pointing to sounds so similar to me. Do you see them as very similar, that you're saying the same, pointing to the same thing?
One thing I would say in Islamic spirituality, there's reincarnation, not on earth, but in those mysterious realms. Your question, if I remember now, was, what if I have gained a lot of enlightenment on planet Earth before I go over to the other side? When I go over to the other side, depending on how much work I have done on planet Earth, I am placed on different levels of heaven. If I have done a lot of good work, hopefully Rumi has done a lot of good work, for example, he'll be placed on a higher level in proximity in the onward journey to God than the work that I have done, as an example. So there's reincarnation. The Quran says you will assume forms of which you have no idea, which is why in Islamic literature you have this poetry about, Jamal, you will be elevated higher than angels. You will assume forms you have no idea about as you continue with that onward journey, depending on which level you're placed after you go to the other side. But the truth is, I am just speculating. I have no idea.
Ravi, would you like to add it?
No, I think really, in a way, my own impression is that in any case, for most of us, in any case, for me, the journey is endless. It may be, if you feel easier thinking that you will come to some end, that's fine. My impression personally is that really, in a way, whatever strikes one as helpful is okay. I think, in a way, this is the reason why different teachings, one doesn't need to be against them, because different people are struck by different kind of calls or different kind of attitudes, partly depending on their cultural background, largely, or even what language they have been reading. And in a way, I often remind people, for example, if I happen to be born in Saudi Arabia of a Muslim parent, I would naturally call myself a Muslim. If I happen to be born in Thailand of Buddhist parents, I would call myself a Buddhist. So it's not that we are actually choosing in our life to what religious practice we are label ourselves to. And then, of course, within each religious organization or religions, not only organization, actually religious organizations have done more harm to spiritual search than anything else, in my judgment. But searchers exist in every culture. But precisely depending on what has been the language they have heard and what kind of things have struck them. After all, Christ was teaching to people in Aramaic and people of Jewish background. The Buddha is teaching people in India of Hindu background and speaking in Pali. So the language itself makes distinctions, different understandings. So my impression is that we don't need to worry so much about what the journey even is for everybody, because each person needs to begin from where they are. If, let us say, if that's 5 people in different places wanting to go to Mount Everest, they need to begin exactly from where they are. If they are starting from the Sahara, initially they will go on a camel. Similarly, if I'm starting from Pacific Ocean, initially I will go in a boat. Why should everybody go with the same way? So my own impression is that if it speaks to you that the journey does end, whatever calls you about that, that is fine from my point of view. Personally, for me, I am actually more inspired by the fact that journey continues. It doesn't end.
And Brother Ravi, just to encapsulate this mystery, I love this story. They say that it's a true story of a very pious king who is visiting this very saintly, enlightened human being, a sage who is dying. And the king goes to this sage and says, the gates of heaven are opening for you. When you go over to the other side, please do me a favor. Please remember me to God. And as you know, the sage says, Your Majesty, when I go over to the other side, I won't even remember who I am. How can I remember you? Total mystery.
Yeah.
Lovely, thank you for that. So, if we are talking about this, and both of you are quoting from, great teachers, historical figures of great standing in the spiritual world across traditions, who have shed light on this path and the spiritual goal. And I'm just, as a person living in present day, and you have had a lot of experience and contact within the spiritual communities from all traditions. Are there living masters of the present day that you would quote with the same sense of reverence and that you know of at present?
This is always a very, in a way, interesting and rather tricky question. Because if I am a young student just starting to learn physics, the kind of teacher I need is quite different from if I am now a PhD student doing some research in physics. It's the same thing about spiritual search. Even person who we may not regard as particularly enlightened in any sense that I understand the word can be very helpful to a searcher who is starting some search. But personally for me, I have actually rather ironic that you should raise this question. Just hardly 2 weeks ago, a book of mine has just been published by the Theosophical Publishing House in India, and it's called Blessed by Mysterious Grace. I earlier called it Blessed by Undeserved Grace, but because I don't feel I deserve it, because I describe there very remarkable people that I have encountered who spent a lot of time and energy with me. Why did they do this? I don't know. For example, Krishnamurti, as an example, or John the Salesman, who was the chief, in a way, the person carrying the Gurdjieff teaching, and two very exalted Zen masters, and Archimandrite on Mount Athos, and many other people. Why would they spend this much time and energy on me? I don't actually know. So from my point of view, that would be an undeserved grace. But on the other hand, the suggestion that there are no wise teachers, it depends on what one regards as wise teacher. Anybody who can help me is a wise teacher from my point of view. But now some people, of course, are highly regarded otherwise. For example, I have personally never met anybody in India who does not have a great respect for Krishnamurti, talking about the people I have met. But otherwise, they have great respect for all, for example, for the great sage Kabir, who was, people keep fighting about it, whether he was coming from the Vedic tradition or from the Sufi tradition. But this kind of argument, from my point of view, is just waste of time and energy. So I personally think at any time in history, there are some wise people. Question is, am I fortunate enough or deserving enough to encounter somebody or not?
To which I'd like to add, am I benefiting by meeting these beautiful, wise people from any tradition, any culture, of any age, actually? So I like this story of this person who has met many, many wonderful teachers, has done many spiritual practices, and now feels, oh my God, I'm becoming enlightened. How? Why? Because for the last 1 month, the light of God, this celestial light, is shining upon him. And he's very excited. Oh my God, the light of God is shining upon me. It's a unexplainable, indescribable, luminous light. He rushes to the mullah. This is happening to me. Am I becoming enlightened? Besides meeting and learning these spiritual practices, now this light is shining upon me. And what does the mullah say? Ask. This is a Hafiz story, by the way. Mullah says, how many goats do you have? Goats? I'm talking about the luminous light of God. You're talking about goats? How many servants do you have? Servants? I'm talking about the luminous light of God. The mullah says, now, if you have become more tender in your dealing with the goats, more caring for your servants, then yes, for sure, that light shining upon you, all the teachings you have learned, that is real. Otherwise, is just a projection of your ego.
Yes.
That is beautiful. And I do feel that what you have, both of you have shared with us, I think if we can internalize that and apply that in our lives, in our spiritual journey, we will have been blessed because you have shared such valuable and inspiring teachings. Someone has brought up a slightly different angle on a question, and it's to do with more or less what is happening in society in general, in America, but also I think across the world. There's this sense of nationalism, of authoritarianism, and kind of that is quite troubling to many people. And often it is to some degree associated with religion or fueled by some religious affiliation, in addition to many other things. And it is very distressing when these very negative forces in society seem to be threatening peace and well-being and possibly even stability. Can you share your personal view and any advice that you can give for us living in the world today who are witnessing some of these very negative and frightening developments?
As a Muslim, of course, this is a very relevant question. A lot of criticism about Islam, no matter what you explain about Islam, about Islamic spirituality, but this is happening, these people are doing this thing, terrorist acts, etc., etc. I want to quote Mahatma Gandhi, who said, if you judge a religion by the behavior of some people, then every single religion is in deep, deep, deep trouble. Yes, we have problems with religion. In fact, the general question is this organized religion, the institution of religion, it is becoming a brand name. It has to be number one. Whether it's Theosophical Society, whether it's this particular brand of Sufism, we all want to be, it's human nature, which is why I love that story in the Abrahamic traditions that God comes down and reveals certain basic truths to some people. But then the devil comes along and says, let me organize that for you. And that becomes religion. Mm. And then Hafiz says, he says, every institution of religion is like a huge lumbering ship that is stuck in the ocean. But he says, thank God, there are lifeboats. And what are the lifeboats? These are the insights teachings of the saints and sages. And Hafiz says, every sane person I know has jumped overboard. That's the end of my sermon.
No, I think this is something very important. I earlier just said, hardly 3 minutes ago, that religions or organized religions have done more harm to spiritual search than any other institution. And they are the ones who have created antipathy with scientific knowledge, etc. One can look at the history for this. But on the other hand, strictly speaking, the trouble is that almost as if an organization is needed, even to preserve, for example, to preserve the great scriptural texts or paintings or music, to preserve the Quran as an example, or the Bhagavad Gita. So therefore, strictly speaking, I don't feel that we need to be against organization, but not to be trapped by them. To the organization, the same thing is true really at every level. Not to be against the devil, but not to be trapped by the devil. So on the other hand, I am very struck by the fact that really any of the great sages, and here I'm happy to have the example of Rumi as one, he actually says in one of his poems, I'm neither a Muslim, nor a Hindu, nor a Christian, nor a Jew. One is free of this. Similarly, some people may be surprised by this, but Vivekananda, highly regarded Hindu sage, he actually makes one comment at one stage that Islam represents the ideal form of Vedanta. This is Vivekananda's remark. So he's not stuck with his own religion. So I think one needs to realize that a sage, in fact, my impression is that at the very best, any religion or even any teaching, any scripture even, this is my impression, is at the very best a finger pointing to the moon of truth. If you got so stuck to the finger, you will never get to the moon. But there is no harm about being slightly informed by the finger pointing to the moon. In fact, I often remind myself and others, friends of mine, if you can see more than one finger pointing to the same truth, that is very helpful, which is one of the reasons I'm very much interested in comparative religion. The way expressions used by Christ, for example, the Father and I are one, no sage in India has ever said anything like this. They would never refer to God as the Father. But is Christ just saying something wrong? One needs to see something beyond the expressions. But if you have more than one expression, it can actually assist you to be a little free of the expressions and to search for something true. So therefore, it can be helpful to study more than one religion or one or spiritual expression. That doesn't mean one needs to be against any of them. It depends on where one is, what one needs, which is why I appreciate this remark of Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, that what a yogi needs to practice at the top of the mountain is different from what he needs to practice at the foot of the mountain. So depending on where a searcher is, different requirements are there.
And I love the words of that late professor of comparative religion, Professor Houston Smith, who says, you know, you can look at for example, I'm a Muslim, you can look at the Quran from one angle. But if you study, like you said, Brother Ravi, different religions, you can look at the Quran from the lens of different religions, and you can have a more complete, a more developed understanding of your own Quran.
Yes.
Which is why we say interfaith is not about conversion. It is about completion, becoming a more developed, complete human being. But I should also add that it is very difficult because most institutions, by the nature of being an institution, being a brand name, they almost feel obligated to focus on recruitment and fundraising. As a result of which, they miss out on the spirituality of it, which is at the heart of every religion, which is so beautiful because of their spiritual heart. In fact, in my ministry, I always wonder, how do we do this interfaith work? Because even among some of our best friends who are very open-minded, they will say, if you really listen to what my particular path says, mine is just a little bit better. That's little bit. That's human nature. So I am almost of the opinion, Brother Ravi, that for me as a Muslim, if I practice interfaith, using the American academic system, I think it's very good that each one of us has a major and a minor. So, for example, my major is Islam. I love Buddhism. My minor is Buddhism. I encourage others to do the same. So they're not stuck, in my opinion, stuck because they have to make it a brand name, stuck in one religion. But that's just my thinking. In our congregation, we encourage that, having more than one major.
Well, I actually have even said that in some of my talks and even published this in a paper. I'm happy to have been born as a Hindu, but if I die merely a Hindu, I will be very sad.
I see.
That is very beautiful and so in tune with this organization, as you well know, and that is why you are some of our best loved presenters, so in tune with the mission of the Theosophical Society. I have a question which poses some discussion. In all traditions, there are great sages, and you have mentioned some of them, Rumi in Islam and others. Can you say a few words on the relationship between mysticism and poetry? Please share a few more names from each tradition.
I defer to Brother Ravi.
Well, my impression is, for example, one example that right away comes to my mind is Krishnamurti, who actually wrote lots of poems. It is true that when he got more and more known, people were eager to hear him give talks, more so than reading his poems. In fact, most of the Krishnamurti people don't seem to know much of his poetic work. No, I have an impression that the sages are not necessarily stuck with one particular form of expression. Some of them spiritual search can lead them to do more physics or more music or write more poetry. So I don't think one should imagine that spiritual search is confined to one particular kind of expression. On the other hand, it is true that certain practices almost naturally are common to them all, one of them being an impartial self-inquiry. This is a fundamental requirement. If I don't see what I am searching for, what stands in my way, that even though I may use fancy spiritual words, but if I am just occupied with how much more money I can get, until I can see that clearly, no progress can be made. Partly because there is a very important principle behind it, really. Self-awareness is the mechanism of self-transformation. Look at the journey of Rumi or journey of the Buddha or any of the people. They saw themselves more and more clearly how they were being seduced by the devil and how could they overcome it. In fact, a very interesting remark of the Buddha, often quoted in the Buddhist tradition, he said, if there was one other force as strong as sex, I'm not sure I would have made it. So to see one's own difficulties and limitations, facing what kind of thing tempts one or removes one from the journey, that is part of the trip. Spiritual journey has a fundamental requirement of a radical transformation of the whole of my being. And for that, a special requirement is impartial and steady self-inquiry. It's tragic to me to see the whole concordance of the Bible. There is not a single entry under self-knowledge or self-study. But the moment you look at any of the non-canonical Gospels, right away you come across many mentions of self-study and self-inquiry.
To which I'll just add, when one becomes a mystic or has a connection to mysticism, it is so hard to describe what one is experiencing.
Yes.
Which is why mystics, they're inspired and they get this inspiration to use metaphors in poetry. So for example, I'll just give an example of human tears. There's a wonderful Sufi poet, Mirza Ghalib, in South Asia, who just uses a metaphor. He says, tears are colorless. Thank God. It's a poetry. Tears are colorless. Thank God. Otherwise, my pillow would betray the secrets of my heart. Tears are colorless. Thank God. Otherwise, my pillow would betray the secrets of my heart. In just this short metaphorical poetry, so much is being conveyed. Let me take Rumi as an example. We can talk about there is suffering, it's inevitable, but there's some good can come out of it. Poetry of metaphor. Rumi says, have you not noticed that fruits never grow on the trunk of trees? Fruits never grow on the trunk of trees. They're always perched on the branches because they need to quiver and tremble in the breeze to receive the blush of the beloved. And then about blush of the beloved, that is what the mystic is graced with. Once the blush of the beloved graces you, once the blush of the beloved graces you, there is no going back to becoming a green apple. Once the blush of the beloved graces you, there's no going back to becoming a green apple. So I think poetry very succinctly and through metaphors conveys some of the insights that mysticism provides, but that is better expressed through poetry and metaphors. And every tradition abounds in those people. So the question also was, what are some other great sages? Another very popular one, becoming very popular in America, and the number one poet in Persia, 14th century Hafiz.
Yeah.
Hafiz is a very wonderful sage. Ibn Arabi, Saadi, Mirza Ghalib, more modern ones. Many of them, they abound.
Don't forget Kabir.
Kabir, absolutely. Oh, Kabir is my favorite. Yes, absolutely. Kabir.
I was so touched by his poetry, I named my son Kabir.
Beautiful. Wonderful.
Lovely. And that actually triggers a question that was on the back of my mind with regards to something you said, Jamal, during your talk, and something that I've heard repeated many times, and I personally think it's kind of misunderstood, is those who don't know speak, and those who know don't speak. Is that you?
Oh, no, that's from Taoism. Those about experiencing God, when you experience God or invisible or the Tao, those who say do not know. And those who know do not say.
Right. Now, often in esoteric circles, that is interpreted as saying that someone who has these deep mystical experiences and realizations will not speak about it. And so there's the idea is that, the guru won't say that he's a guru or whatever. Would it not mean more like that the experience cannot be conveyed in normal language? You can't say it. And the people who try to convey it actually probably don't know what it is.
Exactly. And this was the experience of Shams Tabriz, the teacher of Rumi, it is said that he was in possession of some divine secrets. But it is also said that if you are in possession of some divine secrets, it is like holding hot coal in your hand. You just can't hold it. You want to share it. And he would always pray to God, is there someone I can share this with? Because he was just burning. I want to share this with somebody. No answer. Till one day, while praying, an answer came. Yes, there is one you can share it with. Who? Jalaluddin Rumi, go in this direction. And he did. And if you remember, this is a very famous story. He scaled the walls, and Shanta Tabriz was like a sort of a big, lots of hair, sort of a hippie, holy person, but a very gruff one. He burst in the presence of Rumi, who at that time was, as a very brilliant professor, going over some very valuable ancient manuscripts with his doting, adoring students. And then Shams Tabriz burst there and said, what is all this reading? And Rumi and everybody were so startled by this rude interruption. Rumi looked up at him and said, you won't understand. And if you remember, or maybe you know the story, what did Shams Tabriz do? He grabbed the manuscript, he went to a fountain, he dumped it inside the fountain, and they were aghast. These are valuable, precious manuscript. Rumi came rushing. And what did Shams Tabriz do? He took out a page. The moment he took out a page, it became bone dry. He stopped Rumi and he kept taking out those pages. The moment they came out of the water, they became bone dry. And Rumi says, what is this? And Shams Tabriz says, you won't understand. And that begins their relationship. But yeah, it is about conveying what needs to be conveyed, but which is indescribable, unutterable, inconceivable, as my Hindu friends say about God.
This is really also the reason why, let me quote to you a remark of very highly regarded philosopher in India, Shankara. He says, when the awakening takes place, the scripture stops being authoritative. This is a direct quote from Shankara. That anything said even in the scriptures, which we can honor, respect, learn from, but even there, ultimately the very fact that something is being expressed in a language is already diminishes the truth of it. Because every sage has said that what they experience to describe that is like describing colors to a blind man. On the other hand, they have to say something because their students or even followers are eager to learn something, and they can hint at something. But if you are actually a practitioner, you don't want to get stuck with the words. And then this remark of not only Shankara saying this in the Bhagavad Gita, in the 2nd chapter, I invite you to read carefully. Krishna actually says that only when your intelligence, which is now confused by various different remarks of the scriptures, until that is clear, you cannot come to the truth. Because one can always find different scriptures saying different things. One can honor them, respect them. It depends on when they got said, to whom they got said, what language got used. It can be helpful on the journey, but a remark or an example or frequently used metaphor actually in the Indian tradition, which I find very helpful, that a lamp can be helpful to throw light on your journey if you are walking towards the lamp. But the moment you go past the lamp, it begins to put your own shadow on the path. So it depends. One doesn't need to be against scriptures, against teaching of anybody. It can be helpful up to a point. But what is really required is an actual awakening to the truth. Then some scriptures make more sense, some make less sense. So this is fine.
I think that's beautifully said. If I may just quote Rumi again, metaphor, Rumi says, all the theologies of the world, all the theologies of the world are as nothing compared to one whisper of the beloved.
Yes.
All the theologies of the world are as nothing compared to one whisper of the beloved. And to the other point that Brother Ravi so eloquently put there about interpretation of scripture. Again, the Islamic Sufi saints have this wonderful saying. I think it was Rumi who said, again, it depends on your state of consciousness. Rumi says, ponder on this about interpreting scripture. A bee and a wasp drink from the same flower. A bee and a wasp, they drink from the same flower. One produces nectar, other one produces a sting. So what you interpret is really a function, a reflection, as Brother Ravi said, of your state of consciousness.
Yes. Now, I often actually have made this remark that it's not only the quality of the source that is important, that's obviously important, but also the quality of the receiver who is looking at that source. A very simple example, I have said that more than once, even this morning I said that. Every member of the mafia reads the same gospel as Meister Eckhart or as John of the Cross. So the problem is not with the gospel. The problem is with the reader. So it really is important to see who is receiving whatever is being said. And therefore, how does one enhance the quality of my reception rather than worrying about whether this scripture is speaking the truth or not speaking the truth?
And if I may also add to that, something which was repeated to me again and again, Jamal, don't get too engrossed in all these unnecessary debates, subtle points about theology. Yes, they're important, respect that. But to fight over them. And I love the metaphor by Rumi, who says, when we get overly engrossed, engaged, debating about theological issues, it's like a bird that has tied a knot around its leg and unties it. Makes the knot even more complex and unties it. Makes the knot even more complex and unties it to show off its strange skill, forgetting the point is to escape. And how we have forgotten, to smell the sweetness of the meadows or the fresh air. Forgotten that it is my work to escape, to experience what would be called moksha, mukti, freedom, surrender, being saved. So not to get too involved in theological disputes.
In fact, I especially have been more and more concerned about so-called interfaith dialogues. They're a little bit like at the United Nations. If somebody from Israel says something favorable to the Palestinians, he will be called back home and replaced. So everybody comes and says some wonderful things from their religion, and then they just go home and carry on the same thing. Because personally, for me, if I wish to speak to Jamal, do I have to speak as a Hindu to a Muslim or as an Indian to now somebody living in USA? How do I speak to him as a person to a person? To me, that is really the crucial thing. How can one speak to somebody as a person to a person? And we had a much dialogue like this with Wilford Cantwell Smith. Some of you may know his name.
Yes.
He was the founding director for the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard. And on one occasion, we were asked to have a so-called interfaith dialogue with each other. And we decided he will speak about Hinduism and I will speak about Christianity. Because that way he will say what Christians could learn from Hinduism and what Hindus could learn from Christianity. That was an interfaith dialogue of a very different kind. I always invite people to engage in inter-pilgrim dialogues. Be a real, honest, true pilgrim of spiritual search. Not just believing this or that. Although, of course, we all have some cultural background naturally, therefore we end up being more struck. For example, there is a very famous book written by a great scholar at the University of Toronto. Whole of the English language, all the European languages are very much influenced by the Bible. Same thing, of course, the whole Urdu, Persian, Arabic languages are very much influenced by Islam. Hindi, Sanskrit, etc., very much influenced by Vedanta, etc. All this is inevitable. So one begins from wherever one is, not to be against any of this, but more and more to see how can I learn something and then become free of something that I have learned. That's my suggestion.
That's very, very wise. You know, the biggest complaint about Abrahamic interfaith dialogues, Jews, Christian, Muslims, is that they're very infrequent. And when they are happening, on Christmas, Seder, Ramadan, etc., for Abrahamic traditions, when they get together, the complaint is the behavior is, quote unquote, absurdly nice. But once the people go home,
yes,
Muslims become terrorists.
that's right.
Jews become occupiers. Christians become liars, unless, and this is, we're finding the key, like you were saying, Brother Ravi, to become human and connect on a human level.
Yes.
And continue the interaction. And by the way, after 9/11, there were some Jews and Muslims and some Christians who continued the conversation, and they specifically talked about the elephant in the room, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's talk about it. Let's be open. Let's be vulnerable. And from those conversations, particularly from friendships that developed, that human connection, which is critical to come to know the other on a human level, but requires continuous interaction, vulnerability, perseverance, patience, humility. But from that has developed the Jewish Voices for Peace, J Street Lobby, which is having an impact on public policy today, little by little, but it is definitely being felt.
This is why I recommend becoming a pilgrim rather than a believer in one thing or the other.
Well said. Thank you.
That is absolutely lovely. We will all strive to be pilgrims and hopefully increase that sense of communion, seeing each other as fellow humans rather than a this or that religious affiliate. I do have one question which is kind of related. It's to do with how we can, you've both spoke and in your lecture about compassion and the need for that. So forgiveness, because there are a lot of people who do experience the sense of having been done wrong, something has been done that was hurtful, spiteful, maybe actual, maybe just imagined, I don't know. But if one does have a sense of resentment and hatred, and this is quite common, obviously, in society and amongst individuals, what do you advise with regards working to develop forgiveness and how to cultivate that, how to make that something that we are more able to do?
You know, if I may give the example of the Prophet Muhammad, he was approached when he became victorious, entered Mecca, this man named Wahshi, who had murdered his uncle, his favorite uncle. And he asked for forgiveness from the Prophet. And the Prophet said, of course, I forgive you. You can join the community, but please don't come into my presence for at least, I forget, for 1 year, for whatever it was. There's a teaching here. It's beautiful, it's noble to forgive. But if I forgive without taking care of that wound, of that anger, of that anguish, and I just say, I forgive, without acknowledging that wound, healing it, integrating it, if I don't do that, I am what is called whitewashing a burning house. It's not real forgiveness. I wanted to make that one particular point.
No, I think it is right what you're saying, that in a way, justice has its place also.
Mhm.
On the other hand, the suggestion from all the sages is to develop more and more compassion. If I can actually begin to see that just as in me, so in everybody else, there are limitations of understanding, they have their restrictions, they have their many kinds of weaknesses. So others are also part of that whole situation as I am. That itself actually assists one to accept the others as they are. And therefore, sometimes they do something which I find unacceptable or bad. If I can see this in myself, also limitations, then it is a little easier to be able to bear what the others are doing. So whether this can be called forgiveness or just acceptance of our limitations, I think that actually helps.
Which is why I think restorative justice is very powerful, where the entire community is involved, knowing that we are all interconnected. So the offender or the person who committed, the perpetrator, becomes aware of the harm he or she has caused and makes every single effort to make amends, and the entire community supports that. That, of course, we do that, we strive for that in our community here, with the city here, with the jail system here. So yes, that knowledge that we are all interconnected, we all have a part to play in this. That restorative justice, I think, is critical to really tapping into compassion, justice, and forgiveness, and restitution.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that reflection. It's something that we can all have to learn to cultivate. We are approaching the end of our time for the forum, and I'd like to just open it up for you to, we've had a weekend here, those of us who are in person at Olcott, and of course the people who are on Zoom, a weekend of tremendous inspiration, receiving guidance, teachings that have, I think, uplifted us. And I'd like to just offer an opportunity for you to give us some parting words as we end this National Summer Convention and go back to our lives as they are normally. So please.
Well, from my point of view, actually, before one can, strictly speaking, be compassionate to others, one needs to be compassionate to oneself.
Well said.
To actually see how limited I am in my own understanding, in my own wisdom, so-called. But on the other hand, to more and more to see if I can undertake serious spiritual search, not to get stuck with my weaknesses, but to respond to whenever I am actually called to search for something, and to forgive even my own weaknesses. Then it is a little easier, I have noticed, for me to forgive or to include or be compassionate, whatever expressions I might use, to the others in my community also. We are all mere drops in a large ocean of being. Occasionally, this is actually a remark from the great Sufi sage Kabir in India, when one is connected with something real, almost the whole ocean can act through the drop. That is the call.
Thank you, Brother Ravi. Should I just add on to that, Brother John?
Yes, some parting words of inspiration for us to take with us.
Well, I maybe on the theme of compassion. Of course, that's a favorite subject in our community. And Prophet Muhammad, he said, have compassion on yourself and have compassion on others. I like very much the saying of Lao Tzu in Tao Te Ching. And the words are, compassionate towards yourself, you reconcile all beings in the world. Compassionate towards yourself, you reconcile all beings in the world. If I want peace in the Middle East, in Kashmir, in Seattle, in my family, in my nuclear family, the most important step is, can I be gentle and compassionate with myself? If I am, then my very presence will create healing, reconciliation, compassion with all the others. So this one verse, compassionate towards yourself, you reconcile all beings in the world. So may I, through different spiritual practices, deepen the cultivation of being gentle, being compassionate with myself, which doesn't mean that I overlook what needs to be done. It means I do it with the energy of mercy, of gentleness, but I do that work. As far as this retreat, this convention, I only joined today, and I was so grateful to join with all these rectangles of love. I have truly enjoyed it tremendously, meeting people, cyberspace, reconnecting with Brother Ravi. I heard from Brother David Bland. I was delighted, and with his beautiful spouse, Betty Bland, I believe is her name, and she was the president of Theosophical Society. We had wonderful programs together when my hair was really black, long time ago, and I enjoyed them thoroughly, and I've enjoyed this program equally thoroughly, and for that I thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jamal, and of course thank you, Ravi, as well, for your generosity and kindness and your wisdom. We greatly appreciate it.